Story 1. Background: about 10 years ago, my landlord died, or at least the person who owned the place we were renting did. The property managers had been delighted, but whoever inherited wanted to sell, so the house was for sale. Enter a jerk, we'll call him Jack, who decided to buy the place. Our apartment was on the top floor and attic converted into a suite of a house, less than 35 square meters, 375 square feet. The bathroom was literally where the stairs up to the top floor used to be. The place was tiny. Jack came to check out the place, as you should before buying it. He had one of those Bluetooth earpieces in, and I can't even remember if he acknowledged us. He spent about 30-45 seconds in our suite. The next time we heard from him was about a month later. Apparently, he'd bought the place. He stopped by to give us a notice of rent increase, effective in 6 months, the legal minimum. The rent would go from $485 to $795. The place was not worth that much. We said forget it and decided to buy a house since it wasn't much more per month. Surprise to anyone who's never bought a house. It was more than just mortgage payments. We gave him all the required notice to move out. We moved and cleaned the place up really well. Mind you, when my partner moved in, it was not especially clean, and we happened to have the move-in inspection which mentions this. Jack decided to try to scam us for $80 of our damage deposit for cleaning. He didn't provide the required forms, just said, "I'm going to hold $80 from your damage deposit for cleaning." We responded with, no, you're not. Jack assuming we needed the cash for our next damage deposit or bills and would settle for anything. Take this or I'm going to keep your whole deposit. Cue revenge. So he decided to just keep the whole deposit, $485. I filed paperwork with the rentalsman, who unsurprisingly, after their investigation, ruled in my favor. He was ordered to refund the whole deposit. But Jack decided not to pay, and the rentalsman didn't have any enforcement powers. So I had to go to the local sheriff's office. They could send a legal demand letter for the deposit plus costs, but it would cost me $150, I forget, up front. Sure, go ahead. Jack decided to ignore the sheriff's letter. The sheriff said they could start proceedings to recover the debt plus costs, but I again had to pay up front, about $250, and it might take quite a while. I guess most people quit at this point, being out of pocket around $700. Throwing more money at the problem, and maybe having to wait months didn't appeal to them. And there's also a chance you never collect. I chose to pay the sheriffs. They sent another, less friendly letter to Jack. But here's the best part. Now that they're recovering a debt, they're going to recover on all of the outstanding judgments against him. And apparently, he had tried this before. They sent him another couple of letters, pay up or else. Jack chose else. Then they seized the title to Jack's giant white SUV. I can't remember what it was, but not a cheap one. They didn't physically take it away or anything, but they gave him 30 days to pay all the judgments against him, or they would take it and sell it at auction. Somehow he suddenly found the money. My share, $485 plus $150 plus $250 equals $885. The other people who had registered judgments but not paid to start the collections process were about $5,000. I can't remember how long the whole process took, at least 6 months though. Story 2. My cousin bought a new apartment a few years ago. It came with a parking spot, but they left the spot empty for about 2 years. Later, his wife got pregnant, so they bought a car to drive her to doctor's appointments, etc. We have amazing public transport, but it's not the best option to move around for pregnant women. From time to time, they saw some cars in their spot, but they didn't care before they purchased their own. But a few weeks after purchase, they parked, and the minute they stepped out of the vehicle, some other car behind them started honking, and Karen screamed at them for parking in her spot. Yet, she thought that she earned the right to park there because they didn't use it before, so now it's hers because she can use it better. No. They tried to explain, but Karen just continued screaming. So they gave up, wished her a nice day, and went home. Later that day, my cousin heard weird noises from the parking lot, and there was a towing truck. He ran downstairs, and you might guess which car was about to be towed. Yes, his. Karen stood there with an evil smile chatting with a police officer. Well, the smile didn't last long. Once my cousin understood what was going on, he explained to the police that the car shouldn't be towed, that it was his spot and his car. The officer looked dumbfounded, and Karen went into super crazy mode, screaming, cursing, and yelling at everyone. The police officer didn't care, just politely asked for some papers proving ownership. In a few minutes, he got them, and Karen was charged for unauthorized usage of a towing truck, calling the police, and lying to the authorities. She still complained but paid and never bothered my cousin and his wife again. They tried to find out later who she was. But she didn't live in the apartment building, so it was maybe only a guest of one of the residents. Story 3. A bit of a preface. Besides the landlord trying to underpay me, he also sent me emails prior to the court date saying that I had no chance of winning and should settle for under 50% of the total cost. He claimed he had never lost in court. I waited in the court lobby for nearly 2 hours. The landlord sat close-ish to me and kept trying to make silly banter small talk with me. I ignored him completely. Finally, I was pulled into the courtroom after the office was supposed to have closed about 4 p.m. The judge asked if there was anything she could do to help us reach an amicable settlement without having to go through the judicial process. I explained that I had attempted that before any court proceedings, and the landlord would not accept my offer. His counteroffer was unreasonably low. Unfortunately, we had to proceed. We were sworn in. The judge asked for a copy of the lease. She read off the monthly rent amount and the security deposit amount. She asked me when I originally sent it to the landlord, and I told her around July 4, 2011. The landlord confirmed to her that he received it. The judge asked the landlord what he did with the security deposit. I deposited it, he said. The judge explained that she needed details, what financial institution, type of account, etc. I just deposited it into my Wells Fargo or whatever he said account. The judge let out an audible sigh. Mr. Tennant, were you told what financial institution this was deposited in? I explained that I was never informed. Another audible sigh. The judge asked if she could speak with each of us separately. We agreed, and the landlord went first. About 10 minutes later, they returned, and I went with the judge. I was ready to explain all of the claims he made as to why he was keeping the money, show her all of the evidence I had documented and brought with me. I brought 3 folders, each with its own copies of various things. The judge closed the door to her office and explained that he was going to give me the entirety of the deposit. She explained that since he never disclosed the location of the deposit or put it in an interest-bearing account, he essentially had no case. She explained that the Pennsylvania Landlord-Tenant Act of 1951 is very specific, and the landlord has many things he needs to follow. I asked if that meant he would also be paying for the court fees, about $133. She told me that I could request that, but since this would technically be a settlement, she was being nice and not putting in a judgment against him, but he still had to pay the full amount. She didn't ask him about that. I suggested that he pay half as a sign of good faith. And also I wanted this nonsense to be done with. She thought this was very reasonable. We went back into the courtroom, and she explained that the landlord had agreed to pay the full amount and also informed him that he would be paying half of the court fees. The judge asked how long I'd like to give him. She suggested 3 business days. I offered a full week because I'm way too nice. The landlord offered to write the check right then and there. He did. I received the check, and I returned to him the uncashed check. He originally tried to give me less than 25% of the initial deposit. In my final moments of glory, the judge again suggested to the landlord that he read up on the Pennsylvania Landlord-Tenant Act of 1951, as being a landlord isn't something you should do carelessly. I piped up and explained to him that I had already done him the favor and pulled out the entire agreement, which I had already printed up and highlighted the relevant sections. I told him he could keep it, as I had already read it. The judge said we were free to go. Today was a good day. Story 4. My friend, I'll call her Sandy, worked at a travel agency in British Columbia, Canada. It was a small, owner-operated business with the owner and 3 employees, including my friend. Everyone worked Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. One of my friend's coworkers, I'll call her Jane, an older woman in her early to mid-60s, was a long-time nuisance employee. Among other questionable behavior, Jane was always finding ways to take time off over and above her official paid vacation time. To make up for the lost hours, she would claim overtime hours pay by supposedly going into the office during her off hours to finish up work without being requested by the owner to do so. Despite being caught in her own lies on several occasions and being warned about trying to claim unsanctioned overtime, The owner of the travel agency was reluctant to officially reprimand Jane or get rid of her. The reason being the owner discovered after she had hired Jane that Jane had actually been fired from her previous job at another local travel agency for pulling the same stunts. However, Jane had sued her former employer for unfair dismissal and had won a settlement. After a few years of my friend Sandy working at the travel agency, the owner was ready to retire and offered to sell the business to my friend. Sandy took her up on the deal and took over the business while keeping on Jane and the other employee. Once again, just as the previous owner was afraid to get rid of Jane, so was Sandy for fear of being sued. When Sandy took over the business, she instituted guidelines regarding taking time off and established an official no overtime policy. Jane would still try her shenanigans, but was far less successful in getting what she wanted with my friend in charge. However, Jane still had one trick up her sleeve when she wanted to take time off on a whim. Sandy was a divorced single mom of 2 boys who were heavily involved in youth hockey. She would sometimes leave the office an hour or two before closing to get her boys to hockey practice or a game. To avoid requesting in person and potentially being denied, Jane would wait for Sandy to be out of the office to book a day off if she didn't feel like coming into work or had made plans. Sandy would then arrive at work the next morning only to discover that Jane wasn't coming in. Despite this happening several times, Sandy would usually let it slide since there was now a definite no overtime policy. Therefore, Jane could no longer claim to come in to work on the weekend or after hours to try and make up for the day off. She would either miss out on a day's pay, in turn saving Sandy money as the owner, or it would come out of her remaining paid vacation days. Moreover, 2 people in the office at one time could usually handle everything. Jane not coming in was really a no-loss situation for Sandy. There was one time, however, when Sandy was going to be away for 1 or 2 workdays just before the weekend to take her boys to a hockey tournament. She told both Jane and the other employee verbally and in writing that they could not book time off for the dates in question since she would be away and needed both of them in the office. Within a few days of giving this notice, Sandy went into the office on a Saturday to do some paperwork and go through the sales for the week. This is when she discovered that, only the day before, Jane had booked a trip for her daughter and son-in-law to Las Vegas as well as a plane ticket in her name to Calgary where her daughter lived. Both the trip to Vegas and the ticket to Calgary coincided with the date Sandy would be out of the office. Sandy then checked the vacation booking schedule to further discover that Jane had indeed booked the days off that she had expressly been told she couldn't have. Not mentioning that she had discovered the travel Jane had booked for herself and her daughter, Sandy emailed Jane telling her she would have to deny her the days off since she had already been told they were unavailable because Sandy would be away and needed Jane in the office. Through a continued series of email exchanges, Jane replied and outright lied to Sandy with some excuse about her daughter getting some long-awaited medical treatment or surgery and needing to go to Calgary to help out for a few days and look after her granddaughter. Sandy replied to this lie by telling Jane she knew about the trip she had booked to Vegas for her daughter and son-in-law. That Jane's trip to Calgary was most likely to babysit her granddaughter while her daughter was in Vegas, and that she would still have to deny Jane the days off, especially since she booked them after being told they were unavailable. Jane countered in her subsequent reply, without even addressing the fact that she had been caught in a lie, that she had been a dedicated employee of the travel agency for several years and couldn't understand why she was being treated so unfairly after all she had done for the business. She then wrote that since she wasn't being treated as a valued employee, she had no choice but to retire and was giving her 2 weeks' notice. Despite Jane's threat, Sandy replied that she would still be unable to grant her the days off and left it at that without making any mention of Jane's threat to quit retire. Sandy then contacted her accountant, who also acted as her de facto business advisor, and explained what had happened with Jane. Also aware of Jane's previous antics, Sandy's accountant told her that this was the out she had been looking for with Jane, and she had it all in writing. He told her that Jane had essentially retired, and all Sandy needed to do was honor Jane's desire to do so. Let her finish out her 2 weeks, or pay her 2 weeks' wages in lieu with no further severance pay legally required since she hadn't been fired. The following Monday, Sandy went into the office early accompanied by her longtime partner to act as a witness. She put Jane's belongings from her desk into a box and took the things that were property of the business. Since Jane was old school and had resisted inputting client information into the computer database, this also included a small box filled with index cards that had client phone numbers, addresses, credit card information, and other personal information noted on them. In the meantime, the other employee had arrived for work, and they all waited for Jane to show up. Jane arrived just before 9 a.m., acting as though nothing had happened, and greeted everyone with a good morning as she walked through the door. However, she was apparently taken slightly aback when she noticed Sandy's partner seated in the far corner of the office. At this point, Jane was midway to her desk when Sandy informed her that there was no need to go any further, and that she had accepted Jane's notification of retirement. She then handed Jane a check compensating her for the hours she had worked in the current pay period, as well as 2 weeks' wages in lieu of Jane finishing out her final 2 weeks before her retirement. Jane was dumbfounded and went into panic mode. "But I didn't retire. I'm not ready to retire." Sandy responded that indeed she had retired, given her notice, and had proof of it in writing. All Jane could do was continue repeating, "But I didn't retire. I'm not ready to retire," while unsuccessfully attempting to get the support of the other employee who refused to come to her defense. Sandy then pointed to the box containing Jane's belongings, wished her a happy retirement, and told her to leave the office. Jane quickly rifled through the box and noticed that the small box containing the index cards with client information was not there. She insisted that Sandy return it to her, which Sandy refused to do, explaining that it was property of the business, contained personal client information, and that she would be in violation of Canadian privacy laws if she were to let Jane take it. Jane's shock had now turned to obstinance, and she refused to leave without the box. Both the other employee and Sandy's partner started to get involved, repeatedly telling Jane to just leave. Sandy then informed Jane that if she didn't leave, they would have to call the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, at which point Sandy's partner dialed 911 to inform the dispatcher of a disgruntled former employee at XYZ Travel Agency who was refusing to leave the premises. Within a few minutes, 2 police officers arrived, and Jane immediately ran to the door ranting about being fired and about the missing box of client info. To de-escalate the situation, one police officer told Jane to come outside and explain to him her side of the story. The other officer remained in the office to hear Sandy's side of the story, agreeing that Jane was not legally entitled to the box of client info. The other officer then re-entered the business and told Jane to wait outside. He said that Jane was insisting that Sandy was holding on to her personal belongings, namely a box of important information. Both Sandy and the officer who had spoken to her explained the contents of the box to the other officer, who, in turn, agreed it was not Jane's property. The police officers then picked up the larger box of Jane's personal belongings, took it outside to Jane, and told her she needed to go home. To rub salt in Jane's wounds, the next day, Sandy put up a large sign in the window of the business congratulating Jane on her retirement, and even put a small announcement in the local newspaper doing the same thing. The icing on the revenge cake was Sandy, when filling out the necessary government forms for when an employee quits, gets fired, retires, making sure to check the box labeled retired for the reason Jane was no longer employed. By doing so, Jane was ineligible to collect unemployment insurance benefits.